This video is brought to you by channel partner 4 years running, Squarespace. Stick around to learn more about them, as well as a special offer they're making available through my channel.
Witchfire is a new roguelite first-person shooter that's recently released into early access, and it's from the Astronauts, a 12-person team behind the vanishing of Ethan Carter. Now, it's always difficult to talk about an early access game in this kind of review format, because obviously it's not going to be content complete, plenty of bugs to iron out. These things are a given. Typically, you go into an early access game because you want to see if the foundations are solid, and to provide feedback that the devs can iterate on. So does Witchfire show that promise? Is it worth putting on your radar now or in the future? Well, I've spent about 15 hours with the early access release, and yeah, I mean, this is a game that gets a lot right. It's got an intriguing Van Helsing-inspired dark fantasy setting with stunning visuals, performance is good, and the core gameplay is absolutely superb. The developers have gone on record saying that they were directly inspired by the gunplay of Destiny, and I'm pleased to report that they've nailed it here, as animation, VFX, and sound design all combine to replicate that tight gunplay that Bungie is renowned for. Certainly, on the first-person shooter front, Witchfire's got this in the bag. On the roguelite front, however, I'm not so sure. It feels as if the developers were so focused on providing their own twists that they've kind of lost sight of what makes the roguelite subgenre really work. Maps are not procedural, and with how few levels there are, both in the early access and at launch, I suspect the monotony will set in quite early. This is compounded by the fact that a lot of the experimentation you'd expect from the subgenre is sorely lacking here, as the game focuses less on creating wild, synergistic builds during your runs, and far more on persistent unlocks and upgrades like an RPG. You're also probably not expecting just how brutally difficult this game is, and that risk versus reward imbalance results in a sort of messy, disjointed gameplay loop that never fully clicked with me. But there's a lot of interesting ideas here, taking inspiration from roguelites, souls-likes, and extraction shooters. And while it hasn't quite landed yet, I look forward to seeing if the developers can make this work over the course of this early access period, because the bones here are very strong, and it has the potential to be something quite unique. So the setup for Witchfire is simple. You're a prayer, an immortal magic-wielding, gun-slinging boogeyman whose reverence for God is only matched by your hatred of witches. Your base of operations is here, a cliffside hermitage, and when it's time for you to do some witch hunting, you'll enter through a central portal to arrive on a nearby island where you'll exterminate her thralls and familiars. Immediately, you'll notice that this game looks fantastic. It's utilizing the same photogrammetry workflow that was used to make the vanishing of Ethan Carter. Environments look awesome. It's all highly detailed ramshackle villages and derelict castle keeps. Lighting in particular looks really great, with the sunset spilling through the landscape, accentuating the dense rolling fog. The setting and art style remind me a lot of New World or the Hunt Showdown, all backed up by some very nice looking UI that has that visual consistency and level of polish you wouldn't normally expect from an early access title. It also runs really well. I played this mostly on a laptop because it's very hot in Australia right now, and my studio feels like I'm inside a toaster. I am literally sweating as I'm recording this. That laptop has an RTX 3060, and on ultra settings, 1080p with upscaling on, it's running at well over 60 FPS. I did notice some regular micro stutters though, so most of the gameplay you'll see here is actually a mix of medium and high settings, as I found those reduced those issues. Also only noticed a couple bugs during my playtime, though others have encountered them more regularly. All in all though, in my experience, this is a pretty nice result for an early access title, especially one that looks this good. Most importantly, it plays good. The combat in this game, actually superb for the most part. Now, you've likely seen the trailers and thought, that looks exactly like Destiny. That is no mistake. In fact, the developers themselves made a dedicated post about how much they were directly inspired by Bungie. To quote, "Many times when I am asked a design question by a programmer, my reply is, see how Destiny does it." And that dedication has clearly paid off. The way the weapons handle, the recoil and camera shake, the way enemies flinch to your shots, how they fire slower moving projectiles that you can strafe. Sound design puts in the work too. That satisfying pop of a headshot kill, arrows sizzling past you, rifles loading a shot. You can hear everything, and that directional audio works in concert with the UI indicators to help telegraph enemy attacks, allowing you to dodge them without even looking. Plenty of weapons in your arsenal too. A trusty hand cannon, a pump-action shotgun, a lever-action rifle, and multiple others you can unlock. You've also got your special demonic weapon, a supercharged crossbow that'll dart between targets, able to clear entire hordes in a single shot if you can find the ammo. There's also magic. Light spells include blasting targets with fireballs or freezing them with a forward blast. Heavy spells are on a longer cooldown but are much stronger as you would expect, ranging from a bell that you can toll with a shot to stun all nearby enemies, to an electrified cross that'll tether targets to it. These all have permanent unlockable upgrades as well to further enhance them. For example, my hand cannon, when fully upgraded, now loads stronger shots on the next reload based on the amount of headshots I landed, and it causes my next shot after a reload to freeze an enemy if every shot was a headshot. You can also combine all these elemental effects together for devastating damage. Overall, I really cannot overstate just how well they've done here in terms of game feel. It is just so satisfying to shoot things, to blast enemies with your spells, to land that finishing blow with a punch. And every weapon has so much identity. They've done really well here. To get that stuff so right is no easy feat, and well deserving of praise. Something that may surprise you is just how brutally difficult this game is. I was going into this expecting a witch hunting power fantasy, stacking crazy spells and buffs to eradicate swarms of the undead with ease. Not the case at all. I was dying a lot in the beginning. The hand cannon you start with has quite short range, so you've got to get in very close for maximum damage. The telegraphing I mentioned is great for dodging attacks, but if you do get hit, they'll hit you hard. I'm talking like a quarter of your health from a single blow. Health that, in typical roguelite fashion, you will not get back aside from your limited healing flasks. The difficulty isn't necessarily a bad thing, mind you. To be honest, I really enjoyed learning these various enemy types, perfectly dodging shots, having to get in close and hit those headshots as much as possible. I came to realize it's not a fast-paced twitch shooter. You will find this rhythm where you stay grounded, avoid sprinting or dodging unless absolutely necessary, make every shot count, but that persistent high risk combined with the game's unique structure does result in a rather strange gameplay loop that I think hasn't yet found its footing. The astronauts describe Witchfire as a roguelite for people that hate roguelites. To quote the creative director, we want to take it one step further. For example, in most roguelites, you cannot master an encounter because they are usually all random. So you cannot memorize it like a car track in a racing game. We're experimenting with that aspect while trying to keep the randomization and freshness of each run. So has that experimentation paid off? In my opinion, not quite. When I think about roguelites, I think about firing up run after run, with each one feeling totally unique as a result of random level layouts, enemy placements, and stacking crazy buffs. You experiment with wild synergies on the fly to push as far as you can, die, and then repeat. It's that addicting loop that has you going, just one more run, this'll be the run for sure, and the next minute you look at the clock and it's 3 a.m. Now in Witchfire, I do not get that same feeling, and this is because of two main factors. Number one, lack of randomization. Number two, high risk versus low reward. So first off, as the developers alluded to, there's more of a focus on persistent upgrades. You do not scrap together a build during your runs. Instead, you unlock permanent weapons, spells, and items at the Hermitage. So this presents a problem because a lot of the cool abilities and synergies you might expect to be playing around and keeping things fresh every run have been more or less pulled out of that loop. Things like your dodge creates an explosion, or you summon a lightning bolt that strikes enemies at low health. These are all permanent item unlocks that you'll equip to your character. There are random buffs that you can stack up by clearing enemy camps, but these are a mixed bag. There's the more generic buffs, which are neat, like reloading on weapon swap or dealing more damage during a slide, but then there's also ones that build on specific elemental effects, and if you haven't unlocked items or spells that use these effects, or your loadout just isn't running them, well, tough luck. So yeah, suffice to say, there isn't much experimentation going on during your runs. Once you've figured out your loadout, your moment-to-moment gameplay won't really change that much, especially because you're encouraged to keep those items equipped to level them up through kills. As you might have noticed, Witchfire does not follow the typical roguelite formula of loading into an area, clearing it, grabbing your buff, and then moving on to the next until you reach the boss. Instead, imagine each room is just combined into one big room with enemy groups dotted around that you can kill for those buffs while the boss is waiting for you to take on at any point. These levels are also not procedurally generated like you might expect from a roguelite. They're instead semi-open, handcrafted levels, though enemy spawn locations are random. This is immediately going to be a turn-off for some people. Without the randomized layouts of levels to keep things fresh, and with only 2 of 6 locations accessible at the moment, I think the monotony will set in rather quickly. It certainly did for me over the course of my 15 hours. Alongside buffs, you'll also be picking up Witchfire, which you can use to level up these stats, as well as artifacts, which you can use to speed up unlock progression. If you die at any point during your run, you will lose everything you've collected, but you can go back to your corpse in the next run to pick them back up. In that way, it's kind of similar to a Souls-like, but the genre blending doesn't end there because it's also taking inspiration from extraction-type games like Tarkov. You see, there are portals that spawn in a couple locations throughout the level that will send you back to the Hermitage in order to spend those currencies. So you might think, oh, this is like Hades. It's going to get progressively easier over time, right? But actually, no, because every time you level up, the witch adds more threats to the world pool, causing the levels to become increasingly more dangerous. This is an interesting idea on paper, but the problem is there's no clarity on what the next level up will introduce, nor do the minor stat increases really justify the trade-off. It's like, oh, you've increased your stamina by 3%? Here, now there's a roaming mini-boss that will destroy you in 2 seconds if he catches you. At one point, it'll even add these calamity events. These can happen right at the beginning of your run or when you're trying to escape with all your loot. They will fuck you up and you'll need to drop everything to deal with them. The chances of these spawning will also increase during your run as you loot artifacts. Eventually, your map just becomes full of more difficult enemy types, traps, and random events with no way to scale all this back if you choose, all because you wanted just 5% faster spell recharge or something. I found that difficulty ramp a bit too steep in my experience, but thankfully the developers have already pushed a slew of updates to address this, like reining in the spawn rate of calamity events and slowing the rate at which those new threats are added to the pool. Haven't had a chance to really test this, but nevertheless, it's great to see how fast they've responded to community feedback. So the whole game is a constant exchange of risk versus reward, but that equation doesn't feel quite balanced here. The reward for clearing these high difficulty events, camps, mini-bosses, etc., it's always just more Witchfire, which is a currency that is lost on death. All the while, the more artifacts you pick up, the longer you spend in the level, the higher your risk of death because of the calamity events and all the above factors. As a result, you'll quickly find an obvious path of least resistance. Most of my playtime consisted of loading in, clearing the nearest enemy camp, picking up any Witchfire or artifacts nearby, and then going back through the portal I came from, repeat. It almost felt like I'm farming souls in Elden Ring or resetting a checkpoint in Destiny to level up guns. That's the main thing I was doing, but there's like 3 totally separate loops going on here. You're either grinding kills for upgrade progression, or you're reloading the map over and over to farm Witchfire, or you're just gunning it for the boss. The loop just feels a little disjointed. There's an obvious way to cheese it by just entering and exiting through the portal, and the random buffs you get from camps simply don't feel properly integrated enough at the moment to form a cohesive, escalating experience. The astronauts wanted to move further away from the idea of, all your cool stuff being lost on death, as is typical with the roguelite subgenre. But perhaps ironically, you've still got that while also losing all that diverse experimentation. Instead, you farm enemies in these same locations to fuel persistent unlocks on repeat. It feels more about the destination than the journey right now, and the high difficulty causes you to end up playing quite passively, minimizing risk and avoiding unnecessary conflict, which is a real shame for a game with such exceptional combat. So that's Witchfire. It's available right now in early access, unfortunately exclusive to the Epic Games Store, so take that as you will. It's not cheap, mind you, coming in at $45. That is the full release price. But yeah, definitely one of the more expensive early access titles I've seen in a minute, so I'd hazard to recommend buying in early, unless what you've seen here really excites you. I've tried to kind of avoid the conversation on content offering because of the early access label. However, yes, the fact that there's only 2 maps with 2 bosses is worth keeping in mind, especially with that price tag. Usually roguelites can get away with that kind of smaller content offering due to being more replayable with their procedural generation and randomized gameplay elements. I mean, hell, Hades, for example, only launched into early access with 1 level. But as I've said in this video, Witchfire is lacking those elements, causing it to become especially repetitive quite early on. Playing this game, I really couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the astronauts needn't be so bold. Perhaps this would have worked better as a stock standard roguelite. Just small procedurally generated rooms, clearing enemies with this satisfying gunplay. You pick up your items, buffs and upgrades along the way before taking on the boss, probably dying, and then starting over again. I can picture a version of this game that leans into that power fantasy, using all this fast movement and setting up insane spell and weapon synergies that chain between targets and obliterate entire rooms in the blink of an eye. That is clearly not what they're going for here, and to be honest, I respect the vision. I do believe there's an audience for this, a punishing FPS roguelite with less linear levels, with more persistent unlocks, giving the players more agency over their build, a cool blend of roguelite and Souls-like elements. It's a shame this game doesn't have co-op, because that difficulty and the loadout system kinda lends itself to that level of cooperation. And honestly, there aren't enough co-op roguelites on the market. Nevertheless, I hope this team can bring this all together before the full release, because they've nailed the core gameplay, the visuals are sick, they just need to get that risk versus reward balance right. The long and the short of it is, Witchfire right now is a game with killer core gameplay but a flawed gameplay loop. So while it's difficult to recommend at this point in time, this is definitely worth keeping an eye on, and I wish the astronauts best of luck in this early access period.
Have you ever dreamed of starting your own business? It doesn't have to be the next Amazon. It could just be you making stuff you like to make, selling it online for a neat profit. Maybe you want to provide a service, giving your time and expertise to others. Whatever it is you might want to do, you're probably going to need a website, and there's no better place to build a website than Squarespace. Squarespace provide intuitive end-to-end tools allowing you to make a professional-looking website in minutes. It starts with their templates. Just choose one that interests you, and you can immediately start customizing it to your taste. After that, you can start utilizing all of Squarespace's e-commerce functionality. It has everything essential to transacting business online: ordering and inventory management, support for postage and tracking, accounting support to ensure you're tracking your tax liabilities, plus it supports a huge range of back-end payment options like Stripe, PayPal, and Afterpay. Back in the day, you had to pay companies tens of thousands of dollars to set this stuff up for you, and money every single month to manage it. Now you can do this stuff yourself for a fraction of the cost, making it easier than ever before for you to turn that business idea of yours into a reality. If you're interested and you want to check it out, then visit Squarespace to start building your website through their free trial. And if you want to get serious, use offer code SKILLUP for 10% off your purchase of a domain name. Thanks Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.